Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be speaking to the people in the room, and hopefully everyone on Zoom has got some, it feels as though I'm speaking to you too, because the computer's right in front of me. So welcome, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful to be able to talk on this particular topic. It's something I've done a deep dive into over the last 2 years. So my challenge was actually trying to condense it into the short period of time. It's really a 2-day workshop, but let's start. So this is the very first image I want you to look at. It's called the Wheel of Power and Privilege. The idea is that power is in the middle, and the people closest to power is the internal wheel. So someone who's a citizen, who's white, who's got post-secondary education, able-bodied, heterosexual, neurotypical, robust, slim, owns property, rich, and English. So in our white supremacist world, particularly in the West, that is where power tends to sit. And then as you go outside the rooms, you can see each layer of sort of disempowerment playing out. So I just thought, let's start off the talk by maybe positioning yourselves and just taking a look on each of those little pie slices, what your configuration looks like in terms of access to power. It's quite an interesting exercise, isn't it? Yeah. So, I mean, each one of those little slices could be a talk in and of themselves, but today we are going to be looking specifically at the neurodiversity slice. And I don't know how many people in this room are neurotypical. I am a neurotypical person. And in many ways, I shouldn't actually be giving this talk. It feels a bit like mansplaining, if I was a man, because the truth is one of the biggest critiques of treatment of autistic people and sort of voices in the neurodiversity space has been that it's been foregrounded primarily by neurotypical people. And you couldn't find a worse positioning. So the reason that I wanted you to look at this wheel of power or privilege is specifically around this quote. Power is the ability not to have to learn. So the truth is when we are in that inner circle and we have access to power and privilege, there's really nothing compelling us to go outwards and to find out more about the outside rooms and what it's like, what life is experienced like, what the internal lived experience is. And hopefully this talk today, I don't know how much of you have all been exposed to neurodiversity and autism, but I'm really hoping that today is a bit of a learning around that. So a brief introduction. This discussion is not about the critique of the neurodiversity movement, and any of you who've dived into this will know that as in every single movement, there is division. It's not a shaming of historically held viewpoints. You know, one of the contentious issues around neurodiversity is that as with everything new that we learn, there can be a shaming of what was known before. So all of the parents and teachers and doctors that used to try and shame children for being left-handed and would use conversion interventions to try and make them be right-handed, we don't judge them retrospectively because they were doing what they thought was right. And yet now we know that letting a child determine, you know, which laterality works for them is the way to go. And I think a lot of the pain that can emerge out of the neurodiversity narrative critiquing the old approach to autism has been quite shaming for parents and professionals who've really done their very, very best with the information that was available at the time. It's also not a talk about competitive or comparative suffering. So one of the tricky things when talking about autism is that you have got such a wide range of lived experiences, and you've got, you know, what can look like a profoundly painful lived experience in a child or adult with it used to be the term low functioning. We don't use those terms anymore, but the term is really low masking or high support needs. And that life looks so painful, and you'll see someone else who's also autistic but can really mask well and has low support needs. And there's a kind of comparison around which suffering is worse or more, or, you know, who requires more empathy. And this talk is not going into that. And it's also about not excluding anyone's lived experience. So there's a big movement at the moment, or some would say trend. It's not a trend, it's just a development where a lot of people are identifying as autistic as adults. And I'm going to talk to that. And there can be a division between people who are so-called actually autistic with a diagnosis and those who identify as autistic, who haven't received a diagnosis for a whole lot of valid reasons. And believe it or not, they can kind of be a bit of competitiveness around that. So that's a lovely little intro. And very specifically, I want to say that the vantage point I've taken for this discussion is actually the mantra of the autistic advocacy movement, which is nothing about us without us. And I think that's been one of the most painful things about being an autistic person at the, you know, historically, is that the language, the writings, the teachings, the trainings have been done by neurotypical people. And there are all of these autistic adults now, many of whom are scientists, journalists, researchers, deep diving into the fine details of not only lived experience, but academic theory. And their voices haven't been foregrounded. It seems quite absurd. So the idea that nothing without us, about us without us, to me seems perfectly valid. And in the light of that, I've almost exclusively referenced teachings, writings, and research from autistic people. And I hope that that'll give this talk a lot of depth. So very briefly, the terrain I'm going to cover today is the introduction. Hooray, we've done that. A talk about where the term neurodiversity came from and what does it mean. Why today's focus on autism. Looking at the numbers, I said in the little blurb, the rates of autism have increased over 800% in the last 20 years. I think that's profoundly underestimated. And we're going to talk about that. And then just because they're nice little buzzwords, I thought it might hook some people in to understand the double empathy problem and monotropism, which is actually a fascinating theory of mind. So what is neurodiversity? First off, people often get this wrong. I think I also used to, where we say, oh, he has neurodiversity, or someone has neurodiversity, or they're neurodiverse, and that's actually inaccurate. What we would rather say is, within a group of people, you have neurodiversity. So no one person is neurodiverse. One person would be neurodivergent or have neurodivergence, but neurodiversity is the representation of a whole lot of different neurotypes within one context. So hopefully we've got neurodiversity here this morning. It's the idea that it's normal and acceptable for people to have brains that function differently from one another, rather than thinking that there's something wrong or problematic when some people don't operate similarly to others. Neurodiversity embraces all differences. So Judy Singer, who was an Australian sociologist, came up with the term in the late 1990s, and she was autistic. And since then, the term has gained traction and has almost become a bit of a movement in pushing against a whole lot of conventional treatment around autism specifically, where autism was pathologized and seen as a deficit. I mean, if you even think of the word autistic spectrum disorder, the word disorder is inherently problematic. So increasingly now people refer to autistic spectrum condition or continuum, which is much better. And even in the DSM-5, they talk about disorders, dysregulations, and the autistic advocacy movement substitutes that with differences. So it's gained a lot of traction, and in most research fields, in almost every field or in every area, language that is sort of conducive to promoting neurodiversity has been adopted. So what makes someone neurodivergent? It simply means having a brain that functions in a way or ways that diverge significantly from the dominant societal standards of normal or neurotypical. Neurotypical is such a funny word as well, isn't it? I think it's quite a leveler, you know. Who wants to be typical? And so there's a nice little graph, just kind of giving you a sense of a neurotypical population. Allistic is a term that autistic people have come up with, saying, if you're going to call us autistic, I'm going to call you allistic, you know, like let's just equalize these labels here. And then you'll see there that neurodivergence is a lot bigger than autism. And I'm going to talk to that now. So the different types of neurodivergence, you can just read that through. In fact, I've just seen now I've used a language typo there, because the new way to refer to pathological demand avoidance is actually persistent demand avoidance. And I mean, isn't that just such a simple little change? But to call a condition that a child is diagnosed with or an adult is living with as pathological is so problematic. So you'll see there ADHD and ADD. In fact, there's a lot of overlap. About, well, quite a high percentage of people with autism also have attention deficit disorder. And there's a lot of overlap within these conditions, and a lot of people who have one will often have another. So those are the kind of inherent types of neurodivergence. But there's also something called acquired neurodivergence, which is where structures of the brain change. And in fact, people who are able to engage in mindfulness practice and meditation and contemplative prayer, we know that there's neurological differences, and neural pathways shift and change and reconfigure, and they would then also be considered neurodivergent. But PTSD, complex PTSD and traumatic brain injury would also be considered neurodivergent. And then some neuropsychiatric conditions like bipolar mood disorder and OCD, because we're just looking at differences, right? It's just what's not typical. Oh, and interestingly there, I also put in the fact that empaths, people who identify as being extremely empathic or empaths, have actually very active mirror neurons, those neurons on the side and the temporal lobe that are able to sort of really connect and be highly attuned to someone else's experience. That is a neurological difference, which would mean that they would fall under neurodivergence. Quite interesting, hey? So this is why I'm talking about this. And I mean, I've wanted to talk about this topic anyway, but I thought, you know, pitching it in Global Autism Acceptance Month would be very appropriate. It would be like a good way to swing in. And I think it's important to know that for a lot of autistic people, April is a profoundly painful month. There is a lot of puzzle pieces going around. Now, most people in the autistic community reject the puzzle piece symbol. I don't know if you know that. But if you think about it, what a puzzle piece represents is a piece is missing. Something's a little bit quirky. It doesn't fit in. So it was historically used always, and largely the autistic communities rejected that and have rather adopted the infinity sign, which represents endless possibilities. And in fact, you'll see at the top there, I've put the little gold infinity sign. So on the chemistry table, gold is AU. So the representation of AU being a gold infinity sign. So that tends to be the sign for autism, and the multicolored one is the sign for neurodivergence. It also used to be called Autism Awareness Month, and autistic people are saying awareness is not enough. We actually want acceptance, and on from acceptance, we want advocacy. You know, we're a minority. In fact, autistic people are one of the largest minority groups in the world. Over 75 million people in the world right now. And as I said, I think that's vastly underestimated, are highly underrepresented and misrepresented. So advocacy is the way to go. And the idea is that autism is different, not less. So here's a little 101 on language. And again, I've really consulted a lot of autistic sources here where people say, this is what we would prefer. And I'm very aware that this is not, you know, unilateral. As I said earlier, there's a lot of division even within the neurodivergent community and within the autistic community. But by and large, most autistic people say, please use identity first versus person first. In other words, I'm an autistic woman, not I'm a woman with autism. You wouldn't say, I'm a woman with blackness. or I am a person with femaleness. So it's so intrinsic to identity that put it first. Asperger's, as you probably know, was taken out of the DSM-5 when it was republished in 2012. There's a whole lot of reasons for that. One of them was that Asperger's was a Nazi, and sort of using his name was problematic, as you can imagine. But also what tended to happen with this community of people that quite warmly identified with being an Aspie was that it tended to create a bit of a hierarchy within the autistic community, like, oh, you're autistic, but I'm Asperger's. As if the Asperger's people were quirky and eclectic and eccentric and fairly cool, and autistic people weren't. This is an interesting one, because certainly as a psychologist, when I was trained, we were taught to use on the spectrum. So-and-so is on the spectrum. And what we've recognized since then is that that's quite a euphemism. So people say, you know, when you say, oh, they're a little bit spectrumy, or they're on the spectrum, it's almost a way of avoiding saying something like they're autistic, as if being autistic is a terrible thing. So rather than use the euphemism, just don't use on the spectrum. No functioning labels. Now, I put this little picture on the side there. The reason that functioning labels are problematic is that when you say that someone is a high-functioning autistic person, it's often used to deny support. When you use the term low-functioning, it's often used to deny agency. So this is such a tricky one, because again, as I said earlier, when you see the difference between two people, one of whom is perhaps giving a talk, father of 4, running a business, but is autistic, it's very easy to say that they're high functioning. But I bought a piece of paper I was going to read out, but I don't think there's going to be time. A lovely article by an autistic man who is exactly that. In fact, he has 5 children, chairman of a company, very high functioning. And he says, there's another man who's at the airport, and he's got a sign around his neck saying, please help me, I'm autistic. I am unable to speak at the moment. And this person is a gibbering wreck on anti-anxiety meds, can't function, is really, really profoundly disabled in that context. And then the author of the article says, the problem is I'm that person. I'm both of those people, and that it entirely depends on the context. So this is the idea with autism, is that this particular neurotype inherently in itself is not a disability, but the disability sits in the mismatch between the neurotype and the environment. So we know we live in a neurotypically constructed society. You know, think of the power graph. Us in the middle get to choose how society looks. So we have malls that are loud with music and bright lights and lots of noise and, you know, often flashy things. And so it's the mismatch between the lived environment and this particular neurotype that very often has sensory overload or sensory processing disorder that really elicits this experience of being a disability. So you've got this person who can seem to be high functioning, but the other aspect to it is that that person is also high masking. Have any of you heard of the term masking? Yeah. So the idea with masking is that, and it applies, I think, to all of us, that from when we're little, we learn what we need to be and who we need to be and what society demands. But when you're autistic and you're growing up, you become very quickly aware that there's a mismatch and that there's a difference. And even little children, and particularly girls actually, will look at society and very quickly start to mimic and camouflage and mask and script and find ways to become invisible so that their difference, which is not conscious, you know, little children aren't conscious that there's a difference, but there's a wild peddling of compensation. It's almost like, you know, one of the cartoons where the top of the body is still, but the legs are going wildly. And this masking requires so much energy and so much expenditure that it can actually go okay until very often early adulthood when there's an all fall down, because maintaining that level of masking is completely impossible. So most autistic people learn to mask early and learn to mask well. And in fact, not masking is much healthier. It's much better. So stimming, which is part of being autistic, stimming is sort of movements that are used to self-soothe. And we've got that picture in our mind of the little kid in the corner rocking back and forth. And that's like, obviously, you know, we would all go, oh, low functioning, that's problematic. But actually that child is in a much healthier place because he's being allowed to self-regulate and use the stim. Girls, on the other hand, often use far more invisible stims, like twirling of the hair or sort of more feminized adoptions of behaviors that go under the radar. So again, sure, I'm really going a little bit off script, but there's just so much to say. We know that historically, out of every 4 boys that were diagnosed with autism, 1 girl was diagnosed. And it always used to be seen that boys were way more prone to autism than girls. And now we know that that's not true at all. The girls just weren't picked up. Now they're being picked up in adulthood. Okay, so no functioning labels. Does that make sense about the labels? Yeah. And then, of course, the low functioning label is problematic because you're saying that this person who's actually engaging in quite healthy stimming and self-regulatory mechanisms is therefore unable to make decisions because he's rocking back and forth. But actually, there's a perfectly competent, able person there who's able to engage in life just on their own terms. And constructing a niche in society that's going to be the most comfortable is going to elicit the most agency. And then, of course, no words like pathology, disease, disorder, dysfunction, or sufferers. And again, that's been the big shift with autism research, is that instead of trying to find a cure or a fix or how to change your child or how to be different in the world, there's far more a sense of how can we construct a world that works for you so that everything in you can emerge and flower and be the best person you can be. So rather than functioning labels, use high or low support needs or high or low masking. Rather than disorder, we use the words continuum or condition. And then I've already spoken about the persistent demand avoidance, rather use persistent demand for autonomy. Isn't that just a lovely reframing? Okay, so that's a little bit about masking. This is what masking is: hiding your feelings and moods, imitating facial expressions, and you'll often find autistic people are really good at drama. In fact, there's quite a high representation of autistic people amongst our famous crew in the world, because from an early age, they often practice in the mirror, mimic. There's a high level of attunement. So the capacity to imitate facial expressions into script, and echolalia is often a way even that people do that from an early age. Trying to go non-verbal, and you'll see the word there is non-verbal, not non-speaking. That's another shift that's happened. We used to say this person was a non-speaking autistic, and that is so inaccurate because people who don't use language still communicate. And in fact, now increasingly, there's a whole lot of blogs and online media where autistic people who don't use language are able to write and communicate, and you know, everyone's going, oh my goodness. There's just a wonderful way to connect. Acting normal, bottling up anxiety thoughts and stims, and trying to focus on conversations but zoning out because there's just too much going on. And this can lead to autistic burnout and sensory hangover. So this is often where autism is picked up later in life, is that people come to therapy with what looks like treatment-resistant depression or extreme burnout, and actually it's just been undiagnosed autism. All right, so there's been an increased awareness around autism, and I don't know how many of you have seen that or that or that, but I think that the number of shows on Netflix and circulating on media at the moment has really created quite a significant resonance among people in the population who've been undiagnosed autistics. And they're watching these shows, and although these shows, in my opinion, are quite caricatured, they don't hold the nuance at all of what the full range of autism looks like. There's a lot of resonance because there's a theme and there's a sense of affiliation, and oh my goodness, I recognize that in myself. So some critiques of the neurodiversity movement have said everyone's jumping on the autism bandwagon, and Elon Musk and Hannah Gatsby, and Hannah Gatsby is fantastic. I don't know if you know her, but she's got a lot of material on this. It's become almost like a trend that so many people are now claiming to be autistic. And I want to say to you that I think is just profoundly inaccurate, that where people have a resonance with their own lived experience, we need to pay attention to that. So there is a phrase that, you know, the critique will say, isn't everyone a little autistic? Almost trying to minimize what it's like to be autistic. Like, oh, you know, I've also got a few stims, or I also find sensory overload bad. And just because I've got that, does it mean that, you know, I'm also autistic, and isn't everyone a little bit autistic? The truth is not, there's such a difference between having parts of autism that you relate to and being autistic. It's a bit like saying, oh, I've got a sore back and I feel a bit bloated, therefore I'm probably pregnant. You either are or you're not. It's a different neurotype, but of course there's going to be some overlap in lived experience. And I also wanted to say that we were all taught, and I'm sure, you know, possibly it's the idea that all of you were taught, is that the spectrum was this line, and that there's a line between people who are less autistic and more autistic, and, you know, autistic people are placed along there, and Asperger's is way up here. But actually it's not like that at all. It's a pie chart, and there are many different slices. And a lot of the online autistic tests, which have not been validated as yet, because there's no good test that can pick up autism in adults and in women. So these tests are being used more and more. It'll look much more like this, where, you know, your score on each one of those markers will vary enormously. Yes, like that. So there's nothing, there's no sort of unique, there's no kind of definitive picture of autism. And to say, in fact, it's one of the things autistic people really rail against. Oh, you have autism. I have an autistic third cousin who's married to a, you know, like, as if all autism, you know, when you meet someone in America and they say, oh, you live in Africa. I know someone who lives in Kenya. Do you know them? So, you know, personality differences amongst autistic people are just as varied and enormous as personality differences in the neurotypical population, with all of these little differences. So that's just something to bear in mind. This is an interesting graph. So those are, that big graph that you can see is all autistic diagnoses. And you can see there that it has increased over 800% over the last 20 years. But what's of even more interest, I think, is if you look at the little graphs on the side. So the top one is the age that people were diagnosed at. And you can see that that little top line is actually people who are over 19 years old. So that's where we've seen the greatest increase in diagnosis, is with adult autism. And then the second one is with female diagnoses. So you can see that suddenly that's gone way up because females were missed. And this is my attempt to try and explain the numbers as to why this vast increase has happened with autistic diagnoses. And I have to say that there's conclusive proof it's nothing to do with vaccines. So, you know, those kind of numbers that the anti-vax parties will jump on, but it is really not connected to vaccines at all. The first thing is that there is a descriptor of autism called internalized autism. It's often called female autism, but, you know, we want to take the gender away from it. So how autism looks in girls and women is extremely different to how it looks in boys for a number of reasons. Like I said earlier, girls often learn from an earlier age that they need to conform to societal expectations. So they become masters at masking quite quickly. Boys can tend to be sort of interest-based and games-based, whereas girls have to navigate a world of social nuance and dynamics that almost make them masters at learning how to be. And also a lot of girl interests like gymnastics, horse riding, ballet, which autistic people tend to be drawn towards, because inherently with autism, there's low muscle tone and poor proprioception, that sense of my body in space. So autistic children tend to get drawn towards activities that are going to kind of hone and refine body tone and give a sense of security of my body in space, and also that require hyperfocus. So the little girl who does gymnastics, you know, obsessively and practices over and over again, no one would question that. It is entirely socially normal, but it is real material for a hyper interest or hyperfixation, and also meets those kind of needs for containment, predictability, safety, order, routine, and ritual. It just goes underground. There's a whole lot about female autism. There's a lovely talk by Sarah Hendricks. If anyone's interested in it, I'll send it afterwards, about what autism looks like in girls and women, or in internalized autism, which is the same thing, but it's in boys and men as well. The idea that high masking, camouflaging, and scripting obscures diagnosis is key to this. And again, why so many girls and women just were missed. So that's now being picked up, which is being, you know, is accounting for some of that increase in numbers. I think this is quite an interesting one, because I don't know about you, but certainly before I really went into this, when I thought of autism, I thought of children. And that is the picture we have. And there's almost a sense that there's a cliff. And when children grow up, they drop off it and autism doesn't exist anymore. And actually, autistic children become autistic adults and they function in society, but often are able to find an environment that works well for the neurotype and will become back office people, researchers, academics, you know, surgeons, where sensory overload is not extreme, where there's a lot of control of the environment, and where all of the assets and talents that lie within that neurotype are foregrounded. So they just become invisible. Adult autistics are now recognizing themselves and going, hell's bells, it's time I stood up for myself and started talking and advocating for autistics, because the way I was treated as an autistic child, I don't want to see propagated. I don't want to see that replicated. The treatment protocol for autistic children used to be quite unilaterally applied behavioral analysis, ABA, and a lot of autistic adults are now saying that they would not endorse that. So there's a range, you know, and it's certainly not a unilateral condemnation of the approach. Everything can work, but there's quite a movement towards more nuanced interventions, and interventions that say, let this child become all of who they are, rather than try and kind of contain them and discipline the autism out of them. So online platforms have given autistic adults a wonderful forum to create a voice, because social difficulties are a big part of being autistic, and social connectivity and communication can be hard. But online platforms almost takes that away. And so there's been communities that have formed and support groups that have formed while taking away the sensory overload of in-person connection. And that's really contributed a lot to autistic voices being amplified. And COVID did that quite significantly. COVID for many autistic people was wonderful. So the autistic advocacy movement and the neurodivergent movement have been, those voices have been amplified over recent years. There's been a big challenge to the DSM diagnostic criteria. And so more and more, there's a group of people who are undiagnosed autistic adults or autistic people, and they are being accepted as autistic, given that there's no good diagnostic test. And also there's a lot of barriers to getting a diagnosis. There's expense, there's unavailability of professionals who can diagnose adults, etc. There's also the fact that we now know that there's a very significant genetic component. So before understanding the genetics of autism, a child would be diagnosed as autistic and everyone would go, oh my goodness, it's the vaccine. And now we go, a child's diagnosed as autistic and the parents go, oh, you know, that's interesting because I relate a lot to that. And in fact, my aunt and my granny you know, was a recluse, and so-and-so was a researcher. And there's this sort of backward diagnosis process happening as we understand that this comes from somewhere. And it's no longer sort of shaming or pathologizing, and certainly I hope we move increasingly towards that. There's also a recognition amongst psychologists that when people turn up in therapy, and I think as a therapist, I see, you know, a higher proportion of undiagnosed autistic adults than non-mental health professionals, because it's very, very painful to be an undiagnosed autistic in a neurotypical world. And the sort of sense of difference can result in a profound amount of shame and wrongness, and I'm letting everyone down, and there's something peculiar about me, and self-blame and self-recrimination. And of course, that masking then has lent to quite profound burnout. So yes, undiagnosed autistic people turn up a lot in therapy. And as therapists become more and more educated in this, then those diagnoses can happen. All right, I just wanted to, I'm checking my time, got till 1:30, hey, but we'll leave time for questions. Yes. There's just two aspects of this I want to unpack a little bit. And I had a whole lot here around the DSM-5 criteria, but I thought, let me simplify it. If we boil down 3 key features of the lived experience of autism, it really boils down to these as well as others, but it's social differences. And that, I think we know, we've all been exposed to the caricatures and stereotypes of autistic people like Rain Man, which is a very poor representation. But that social fluidity is often difficult for autistic people. There's cognitive differences and there's sensory integration differences. So I just want to present to you 2 ideas of conceptualizing those in an alternative way compared to the impairment or the disorder hypotheses that used to prevail. The first one is the double empathy problem, which is really saying that it's not that autistic people have got social difficulties, is that it's just that the difference between the neurotypes creates dissonance or difficulty. There's a double empathy problem. So the autistic person may struggle to read between the lines, to overcome other people's misperceptions about autism, and to manage sensory distractions. So I'm talking to you, but I'm autistic, so I'm quite overwhelmed by all of the other sensory input and reading where you're at, and sometimes being hypervigilant and overly attuned because I'm so used to masking and reading you. There's all of that going on. The neurotypical person or the non-autistic person may struggle to form positive first impressions because they're going to be going, oh, there's something going on here, may struggle to recognize and understand autism, and may imagine autistic sensory difficulties. So there's a difficulty from both of the neurotypes that come together and mean that both parties may struggle to understand each other's thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and differences. So you'll find that neurodivergent people actually get quite drawn towards other neurodivergent people because there's such a match. And neurotypical people will find it easier to talk to other neurotypical people, but it's the combination of the two. And because society is being constructed around the societal norms of neurotypical people, guess who gets normalized? And suddenly it's the autistic person who's pathologized. So that's just quite a nice way of understanding what is so-called social difficulties. And Sarah Hendricks, the person who I spoke about earlier, who gave that talk on autism in girls and women, she says she's autistic. In fact, she trained people in autism for decades as she went and trained professionals, teachers, psychologists, and it was only in her 40s that she was diagnosed with autism. And she went, can you believe I've been training everyone on this for so long? But she said, you know, as an autistic person, when I'm talking to a neurotypical, I can see you going, oh, there's something funny here. She says, but let me tell you the truth. I don't find neurotypical people that exciting either. And then with regards to the cognitive difference, now this is so interesting because autistic people have got a superpower, and that superpower is the ability to immerse in material and data to an almost superhuman level. That capacity for hyperfocus, or what's often known as sort of fixation or special interests, allows for deep dives that neurotypicals could never even dream of. There's also quite a sort of enhanced capacity to notice patterns, and a lot of our significant scientific breakthroughs as a human species has come about because of autistic people spotting patterns and kind of breaking through a new frontier. So this alternative hypothesis of monotropism, I'm just going to read it rather than talk about it. It's a theory of mind posited to be the central underlying feature of autism. In essence, it's a cognitive strategy related to the distribution of attention. It's a tendency to focus attention on one thing at a time, with difficulty shifting attention and processing multiple stimuli which might support understanding. A monotropic mind is one that focuses its attention on a small number of interests at any time, tending to miss things outside of this attention tunnel. This leads to atypical strategies for the allocation of attention. In a nutshell, monotropism is the tendency for our interests to pull us in more strongly than other people. So what that means is you're talking to an autistic person, but they are deep diving into something. It'll look as though they're oblivious to you, insensitive to your needs. When there's communication of that special interest, it could look like info dumping and not being attuned to your conversational needs of pacing. It'll look like perhaps flooding of information and not being sensitive to the needs of another person. But actually, it's just this incredible capacity for absolute absorption that, in my opinion, and many people's opinions, that the human race has relied on for our survival and advancement. And yet, because it can look at times to be less empathic, it has been pathologized. My feeling is actually that autistic people are some of them, and again, I can't use a blanket term, but the capacity for empathy with autistic people is way more developed than with neurotypicals. And very often the overwhelm of empathic connection requires a retreat because there's too many feelings and too much attunement. So that's quite an interesting hypothesis, isn't it? And it would explain, if you look at each presentation of autism, even with the high support needs child or adult, this theory would actually go a long way to explain a lot of even that high need for self-soothing, because this emotion is so intense. There is so much more. This really is a 2 or 3 day workshop. There's loads of material I can send if anyone's interested. There is an explosion of resources on the internet and on social media. And I really encourage you, if you're interested in pursuing this, if it sparked an interest, dive deep, because it is like opening a whole new world, and the riches to be found there are immeasurable. So that's it for now. Thank you for having me. And let's hope we can have some time for questions.
Well, that's what I have your attention. Is it advisable, if you suspect someone close to you of being autistic, to open it towards this person, to try to get this person to be diagnosed? Could you repeat the question?
Okay, so the question is, if you believe that someone around you, someone close to you, could possibly be autistic, is it worthwhile opening up that conversation? And it's endlessly debated. In fact, I have to say that there are a lot of pages on Facebook and on social media that are run by actually autistic and self-identified autistic people who discuss these themes quite extensively. And almost unilaterally, the answer to that question is, it's an incredibly painful, because of the historical bigness of the word. Autism is a very, it's a very big thing to put forward to someone. And yet almost everyone who has gone down that road has said that the process of self-discovery and self-healing and self-forgiveness is infinite. And that living in a world feeling as though you're wrong the whole time, and as though you're letting people down, and as though you're not enough, and as though you're not trying hard enough, is a lot more painful than coming to terms with this diagnosis. It can feel, you know, so pathologizing. So I think that it's something that needs to be very sensitively and carefully done. And luckily, there's a lot of books that have been written now that approach this topic from the angle of neurodivergence, rather than going straight into autism. And I mean, you saw with those circles that there's the estimates are that 30 to 40% of the population are neurodivergent. That is a lot of people. So kind of engaging with the neurodivergent material is a softer entry point and covers a lot of the same stuff. And from there, you'll often find the person is pulled forward into exploring this themselves, because there's this profound relief. Yeah.
Things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and dementia, is that also neurodiverse?
Yes, and that would be, I suppose, acquired neurodiversity. That is something that comes, you know, after being neurotypical. Those things then would take you into the space of being neurodivergent. Yeah.
Your comments about one of the most famous or successful sitcoms from Big Bang Theory is problematic to our hormone degrees. So, I mean, I haven't watched any of those other shows. You have a comment about that. It's quite fascinating to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think I haven't watched a lot of Big Bang Theory, but I think what's useful about it is that it foregrounds autistic people with high cognitive ability. So again, the stereotype we have is that, and because the tests often picked up young boys who had intellectual challenges, and that sort of is easier to pick up. So that's often our picture of autism, and Big Bang Theory kind of brought along the savant angle and the idea that there's brilliance and there's innovation, and I suppose brought the conversation into the general domain. Yeah.
There was a lot of pushback about the caricature.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think all of those TV programs caricature autism and what it looks like, and amplify the social stiltedness where most autistic people are so good at camouflaging and masking that it's invisible.
So maybe the online questions.
Is there a question there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for, I'm sorry, I got a bit lost. It's quite a big thing.
Oh.
So in terms of, so obviously I'm Black, I'm coming from communities that wouldn't have, sometimes it would feel like access to be able to diagnose autism. But I'm thinking as a minister, pastoring people and trying to help them. Not even stigmatize and say autistic, that's a problem. Or a cognitive brokenness, whatever it is. But how do you go about, are there accessible ways of, if not diagnosing, but just knowing how to harness whatever, not that everyone is autistic, but as you were showing that diagram, that there's sometimes stereotypes, but some breakthroughs, some innovation can come from people. Just instead of stigmatizing and being unhelpful, just harnessing it.
Yeah. So, I mean, the point is that in societies or communities that are underserviced, really, there's real difficulty with access to diagnosis. And I have to say that is a worldwide phenomenon. And it's a big part of the autistic advocacy movement's agenda, is to try and kind of find ways to provide resources to underserviced communities. because that's, again, with the numbers on autism, underprivileged communities are almost entirely missed. So those stats don't include underprivileged communities, or in fact, cisgender white people are almost the only ones that the diagnostic tools catch, and that everyone else basically is missed for a whole lot of reasons. So there's a big drive internationally to try and avail that full range of missed people with opportunities for diagnosis. But I think in the meantime, because that's going to take a long time, what we can all do is to recognize individual neurological differences and try and create structures that accommodate people rather than needing everyone to fit into the same box. So for example, I think it's Tesco in America have now got autism shopping hours or neurodivergent shopping hours, where they dim the lights, they turn off the music, it's quiet, they only allow a certain number of people, so that people who have sensory overwhelm can come and shop. And I think in churches, being able to be sensitive to the fact that some people might find the loudness overwhelming. And again, this is where COVID was so great, is that for neurodivergent people who get overwhelmed with noise and people and senses, being able to attend online has allowed so many people to re-engage with communities. So it's those kind of accommodations is the wrong word. Those kind of sensitivities and constructing alternatives that is just going to be so useful. Online home groups or, yeah.
Might have missed something, but notwithstanding everything you said in the significance, just generally all of us, including all of you and your people, we normal people, or what do you call us?
Neurotypicals.
Yeah, neurotypicals. How do we respond in a situation where you think that a particular person close to you might be not be without intimidating, without stigmatizing? There's a sense in which this question carries my question, which was good.
Yes, yes.
In other words, what are you advising us to do in our normal life spaces?
Yeah. So that's such a great question. And if we go back to that circle that I started off with, which is that access to power, is that I think that however close we are to the center of the circle, which is power, we need to make sure that we are turned outwards, teaching ourselves about things that we don't know, and taking the initiative to hold things open rather than insist on sameness and things that we are comfortable with. Okay. Are there any questions online? Let me go there. Okay. I'm just looking here. Why are interpersonal interactions so inclined to generate sensory overload? So that's really, if you think of an autistic person's attention focus and propensity to be interpreting, to be over-reading cues. So there's a conversation that's happening, and one-on-one is a lot easier for neurodivergent people, because you're only concentrating on one conversation. So even in that one-on-one conversation, there's multiple streams of information coming at once. I'm reading your social cues, I'm being hyper vigilant, I'm being overly attuned to what you're saying, because I've been taught from an early age that I need to be observant and masking and watching, and I'm listening to the words that you're saying. And simultaneously, I've got a whole lot of information that's coming up from within me. And possibly I'm in the midst of being absorbed in a special interest or hyperfixation myself, which is absorbing 90% of my mind's capacity almost permanently. And so my availability to engage in that conversation is quite disrupted. In addition to that, a high percentage of people who are autistic have got sensory processing disorder, which means that not only am I dealing with invasion of light, sound, sense, different noises, my own internal senses around interoception, neuroception, proprioception are all firing in overdrive. And I've got to try and regulate all of that input all at once and have a conversation about the weather. It's really hard. I hope that answers that question. Could trauma trigger autism, or is one born with it? Oh, such an interesting one, because there has been such correlation with adult autistics who have been diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, we know that's different to post-traumatic stress disorder in that it's the accumulation of almost micro traumas. And some adult autistics will attribute that to the fact that they went through ABA, which is applied behavioral analysis, which almost is like kind of conversion therapy, that try to cull their stims and force them into being neurotypical in ways that they inherently weren't. But other autistic adults who didn't experience ABA have also got CPTSD, because the experience of living as an autistic person in a neurotypical world is of itself can be traumatizing. And I want to put a caveat to that. When it's been undiagnosed, that trauma is amplified. So when a child is diagnosed with autism, there's, the world is automatically reconfigured, and the support is usually given and the right environments are created. But when a child is really good at masking and doesn't get all of that, then the diagnosis in adulthood of complex post-traumatic stress disorder is not unusual. I hope that answers that question. So I don't think trauma in and of itself, I actually don't know the answer to that question, because complex post-traumatic stress disorder can look a lot like autism. Is there any definitive evidence of how and if anything triggers autism in utero? Oh my word. This is where I need to pull in my daughter. She's doing her PhD in the microbiology of autism, or molecular biology of it. And it is a biochemical process of note. I can't even pretend to understand enough to answer that question, but I do know that there is extensive literature on it if you do want to do a deep dive. Maybe we'll pull her in to talk on another time. Let's see, are there any other questions? I think that's all the questions there. And time is up. Good. Thank you for having me.